Hello. Dr. Vakita, Rector Janssen, faculty, students, council chair and council members, staff, guests, I am thrilled to be here. It is a terrific honor. And my dear friend, Professor Pumla Gobodo-Medikazela, I will go anywhere you ask me to come. It is my honor and delight to be here, especially because of the theme of this lecture. I would like to promise to be short, but other than my height, I cannot promise that. I think all of you who came here today may be wondering about the project of reconciliation. Given the events here last week, given, sadly, a terrible event at a university in my country last week, the project of reconciliation can seem abstract, remote, even a failure. When you have distressing evidence that we do not have success with reconciliation, we in fact have latent fears, anger, it's hard to know what to do. It's hard to know what to do with the feeling of frustration and anger, resentment. It's hard to know how to proceed, how to talk. And I am here as much as anything to listen to you and to share with you the challenges. And therefore, I look most forward, not to my lecture, but to our discussion together. I confess one of my favorite cartoons shows a man at the beach, the seashore, and he's holding a seashell and he's talking into it. Rather unusual scene. There are two women looking at him saying he never was much of a listener. I was not here last week. I don't know exactly how you all feel. But with a heavy heart, I must tell you that I have had experiences. I had a recent one when I learned about the incident here. When I became dean at Harvard Law School just 4 years ago, we had a challenging episode when a student, a white student, sent a message to another student that then went viral and commented as if it were a matter of fact that African Americans have lower intelligence than whites. It was a shocking thing to do, and I was a new dean. What was I supposed to do? I met with many people who said, freedom of speech, we're an academic institution, that's our most important value. And others said, privacy, you send an email, you don't expect it to go viral. It's not her fault. I sent a message to our community in which I said I respected free speech and I respected privacy, but I also thought that both of those were to be exercised with responsibility. And I criticized what the student had said, and my email went viral. And I was attacked. And there's a terrible caricature of me on the internet at the moment. There's something about social media that makes these issues even worse. Because people, I think, dash off the message and don't think about its effect. And don't have the experience of seeing face-to-face the person that they have sent the message to. That raises the central question about membership. With whom are we in community? With whom are we in conversation? And I worry that with technology we have less ability to know who our community is. As I turn to think about the subject for today, it was before last week, and I thought I would pick a subject that isn't necessarily an easy one, but is urgent, and is urgent in my own view, because I think that the issue of getting along after conflict, getting along where there has been oppression is urgent. I have worked in post-conflict societies. I've worked in Kosovo, for example. I've consulted and worked with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. And I've worked in my own country around issues of racial justice. And what scares me is how similar these circumstances are. The circumstances in which there are mass killings are not far from the circumstances in which there are simply protests about school children going to school together. Because in both circumstances, there are patterns and practices of people calling other people names that make them less, names that make them other. And finding ways to speak of the degradation of other human beings and to resist it is my own professional work. I did have a terribly memorable conversation with Dr. Orbinsky, who was the then chair of the local branch of Doctors Without Borders in Rwanda, just as the genocide was unfolding. And he explained to me with a kind of horror still on his face, going to the leader of a children's hospital as the rumors of the genocide were emerging and saying, can we take the children out of this hospital so they can be safe? And the head of the hospital said, well, no, they're staying here. And Dr. Orbinsky said, do you have children? And this head of the hospital said, yes, I do. And he pulled out the photographs and he showed them very proudly. And then Dr. Orbinsky said, but these are children too. The head of the hospital was recalcitrant, nothing happened. The next day, half of them had been killed. How do people prevent something like that? Here was an effort to prevent it. I don't know. How do you go on and live after, if you were lucky enough to live? I don't know. I do know that the usual practice through much of human history has been either silence or retribution. Those have been the responses. And I think that that has not worked. I think that silence produces rage, understandably, and retribution produces the cycle of violence. So I think that rather than ignoring what happens and rather than retribution, it would be good to reach for something more, and that's the question. That's the question that's posed by reconciliation. One thing that I have tried to do in conversations with people is to say, reconciliation sounds a little ambitious. Let's start with coexistence. Another reason I say that is when I met Alex Bahrain for the first time, the vice chair of South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I said to him, I don't understand the reconciliation part of the title. What does that mean to you? And he said, reconciliation means to me, I'm walking down the street and I see coming towards me someone who was a member of the secret police, and he sees me, and we keep on walking. That was a surprise to me. That's why I offer the word coexistence, at least as a starting point. Reconciliation has come to mean many, many things. It's contested in its meaning. It has a religious meaning, and in some religions means a deep atonement that leads to a transformation. Some think reconciliation means submission, resignation, giving in, giving up. Couldn't be more different as kinds of meanings. Some think that reconciliation means acknowledging interdependence. Some think that reconciliation means building the conditions of trust, or the conditions for the conditions of trust, or the conditions for the conditions for the conditions of trust. Does reconciliation have a religious meaning, or is it secular? Does it involve punishment or accountability? Does it involve a truth commission or prosecution? Does it involve amnesty or responsibility? These are debates, and I'm not going to resolve them now. But I decided that here today I would put forward the idea of forgiveness as one of the ideas that should be accompanied with reconciliation. And what do I mean and why consider it? By forgiveness, I mean a conscious, deliberate decision to forego rightful grounds of resentment towards one who has committed a wrong or a harm, or groups who have committed a wrong or a harm. A deliberate decision to let go. To forgive, then, in this definition, is not an obligation, it's a choice, and it's held by the one who was harmed. Forgiveness can offer benefits to the offender. It can relieve a sense of isolation. It can offer solace and acceptance. It can benefit the victim, who can forgive and in that moment let go of resentment, regain a connection, or simply feel empowered by the choice to forgive. Though the choice not to forgive is equally, if not even more, empowering. Forgiveness, tolerance, and mercy figure prominently in philosophic and religious traditions across the board. Humanism, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, Baha'i, Hinduism, Confucianism, many, many, many traditions talk about forgiveness. Widespread and honored, yes, but forgiveness is really hard to enact. It's really hard to let go of resentments. I drive in a terrible city of Boston. I do not forgive any of the other drivers. Forgiving family members and neighbors who harm us is a daily challenge. Some find it impossible to forgive if the wrongdoer has not apologized or made amends. And some acts are simply unforgivable. I saw recently a documentary that I recommend called The Act of Killing. It's a documentary about the massacres in Indonesia that began in 1965 and led to the deaths of about 2.5 million people in a year. Mass murders, mass cruelty. It defies understanding, and it has also escaped any public reckoning. Since 1965, there has been nothing. This unusual film focuses on the interior lives of perpetrators who are still alive, getting old, but still alive. And unlike any other film or book or any response that I've ever seen to gross violations of human rights about which I am aware, this film by Joshua Oppenheimer invites two unrepentant perpetrators to reenact their actions. Apparently delighted by the chance to be on film, these two elderly perpetrators show no remorse, no flicker of self-doubt, and indeed kind of take on the project of making it a film like a gangster film until toward the end, when at the request of the filmmaker, one of them plays the role of a victim, and only then does he choke up. These people challenge me. Some acts challenge me because they look like they're beyond the bounds of forgiveness. It's not always right to forgive. Some things are unforgivable. And letting go of resentment surely cannot be forced. Declining to forgive can, in fact, express a fair expectation of accountability and responsibility. And indeed, the desire for revenge, the desire, not the revenge, but the desire for revenge can be understood as the wellspring of a sense of justice. I was wronged. That's crucial. A wrong should be made right, and intended harm should meet a consequence. Now, forgiveness can operate, however, and not just between individuals, but also between communities, societies, and nations. But can it be encouraged? Should it be? And if so, when and how? Now, I'm a lawyer, and I can't help it, but I think about law whenever I think, could something get better? And I have to even confess, I became a lawyer because I was hopeful that law itself would help reconstruct life, society, would help attack discrimination, unfairness, would help me become a soldier in campaigns for justice. I was inspired by the statement, civilization progresses when what was once thought to be a misfortune is now understood as an injustice. Because when you see something bad as an injustice, you want to do something. You're mobilized. You want to bring collective power to bear. And collective power can be used to promote or even to directly express something that looks like forgiveness. Law can discourage forgiveness. It can encourage it. Law can punish people who apologize, and in so doing make forgiveness by the victim less likely. This is the rule in most states in the United States when it comes to malpractice. Doctors and nurses, therefore, when something goes wrong, don't say, "I'm sorry," because they're fearful that will be admitted to court, and therefore the very human impulse to make amends is interrupted by the law. Law can construct adversarial processes that render forgiveness less likely than it would otherwise be. Or law can give people chances to meet together in spaces where they may apologize and they may forgive. Law can play many roles in the forgiveness world, and here are a couple examples. Imagine a husband and a wife, or in those communities that recognize same-sex marriage, a wife and a wife, who are on the brink of divorce. Now, the legal process could require them to try to mediate their disagreements, and a good mediator will call upon each spouse to express the grievances and desires of the other person before anything else happens. Even if they proceed to divorce, the spouses may become more cooperative once they see the other's point of view or have the chance to speak it. Now, a really good mediator, I know one who did this, will schedule the first mediation session at a terrible time so that the warring spouses will have common ground right away. They hate the mediator. Now, some might find it offensive even to be told to talk to a former spouse, much less forgive one. But in finding a capacity to let go of resentments, the forgiver may gain some freedom and certainly a better path for cooperating in the future around such matters as tending to children. Second example, consider victim of physical assault. Law could put the question of prosecution in the hands of the victim, and as a result, no prosecution would proceed unless the victim says, "I want to." Then a victim who chooses not to proceed holds the authority to make law forgive or not. But instead, the law could treat the assault as a violation of public norms and go ahead with a prosecution regardless of what the victim wants to do. And a good argument for this approach is that a victim may decline to prosecute not out of forgiveness, but out of fear of reprisal. Prosecution then can proceed regardless of the victim's point of view, but that's not the end of forgiveness. The law can turn to a victim later once there's a conviction. And if the victim wants to introduce forgiveness, the law can make that part of the punishment process. Third example, government may help people forgive financial indebtedness, and it's even called forgiveness. This may be debts between people. It may be sovereign debt, which is the topic I've become captivated by. When should sovereign debt be forgiven? I don't know, and I'm working on it, but it certainly seems to me plausible that there are occasions when it should be. Instead of proceeding case by case, law can use categories and decline to prosecute, for example, anyone who commits an assault in self-defense. Why? Because law forgives it. Law could forgive anyone who ends up killing an abusive partner. Clemency, pardons play a role in criminal law, or the government may enact an amnesty, a general pardon before any prosecution, say of protesters of environmental harms or of immigrants who entered the country illegally. This may be an expression of forgiveness in the way that I've described it, or it may instead express a political judgment about the behavior at issue or the costs of prosecution. And following a civil war or mass violence, the law of one country or international law can call for prosecutions for those who violated human rights, or instead call for forgiveness. collect victim statements for history and memorials. And of course, this takes us to the TRC. South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission is an example for the world. Whatever you may think about it, outside of South Africa, people point to it in country after country. When I work in countries dealing with conflict, people say, I wonder if we can do what South Africa did. So it may not work entirely inside the country, outside the country. It's had a huge effect. It's a touchstone for transitional justice. Did it help this country, though? Did it help this country address and move beyond its conflicts? I've been reading the work of academics about this, and guess what they say? It's complicated. Mixed results is one way to summarize the empirical studies of public opinion. It is clear that the TRC offered a forum for victims to speak, a forum for investigation, some discovery of what had gone on and what had been denied. And over the 3 years of its operations, the TRC invited victims to tell their stories, and many more came forward than were predicted, invited perpetrators to apply for amnesty, conditioned on their telling the truth and showing how their actions were limited to and proportional to political motivations. And by inviting observers to register comments and holding sessions around the country, by broadcasting them, by publicizing its report, the TRC offered vehicles for public acknowledgement of events long denied or unacknowledged publicly. The hope was it would prevent cycles of revenge. And I'll just have to ask you, has it worked? You're in a better position than I am to assess what worked and what did not. But I will suggest that from afar, there are 3 points that strike an international observer before I return to my broader questions about forgiveness. First, I am very much affected by the initial responses to the report. While the TRC was challenged in court by the ANC and by the family of Stephen Biko, the Commission's report also elicited vehement attacks by former apartheid officials, police, and political leaders. And Paul van Ziel commented right after the issuance of the 5-volume report. He said, "The fact that both former and current rulers were distressed by aspects of the TRC is perhaps the strongest evidence that the TRC fulfilled its mandate in a fair and impartial manner." Because the fact is, any transitional justice effort is likely to trigger criticism and contest, and yet how much better, because of disagreements, and because they are well distributed rather than lopsided on one side, is a society. Second observation. Although the studies report ambivalence, disappointment, negative and mixed views about the TRC, it does seem to have coincided with and maybe contributed to the relatively peaceful political transition to democracy that is, frankly, an absolute miracle. I cannot point to another example. And that inspires people all over the world. And third, your TRC has in turn inspired transitional justice efforts in Rwanda, Sierra Leone, Cambodia, Liberia. It turns out 40 jurisdictions now, including Greensboro, North Carolina, in the United States, that created a TRC to investigate the killings of union activists by the Ku Klux Klan and Nazis. When I speak about the TRC and other transitional justice efforts anywhere in the world, people are captivated by the story from South Africa. People say, as one principal of a school did to me, "We need a TRC right here." There's a lot to learn about the impact of TRCs, and the doubt that researchers and others have shows healthy humility. More remains to be known. But here's my real question for you. Why is the story so compelling? Why are people so taken with it? In the face of such ambiguity and even negative responses, and I offer these speculations. The language and examples of leadership by Nelson Mandela and Archbishop Tutu have a lot to explain the power of the TRC. It did offer a narrative an image for communities struggling with conflict and violence and hatred, that you could proceed with building a future in a constructive way. In fact, the TRC did create a climate and a proximity that allowed some individuals to engage in communication around apology and forgiveness, even though sometimes it was with really good public relations rather than reality, but the public relations were really good. It coincided with national and international conflicts, creating ready audiences for the idea of a third way between silence and revenge. And a combination of religious and political and communal ideas about the values of reconciliation and forgiveness made the story of the TRC compelling, as did particular stories about particular victims and applicants for amnesty who came into relationship through parallel proceedings, being physically near one another, allowing for apparently spontaneous exchanges, sometimes forgiving, sometimes apologetic, sometimes both. The TRC created space for that. There's a myth and there's a reality, but boy, is it powerful. The actual numbers of people involved in the TRC who say they engage in forgiveness is small. One study indicates that of 429 participants who were surveyed, only 70 ever even discussed forgiveness, only 10 were willing to forgive if the wrongdoers took responsibility for their deeds, and only 7 were willing to forgive without any conditions. Small numbers. And yet, skeptics who question the power of the TRC, I think, are understating its impact, both domestically and internationally. Why? Because it at least provided this. It provided a break. It provided a ritual. It provided a touchstone, something to say, well, we did do that. Now, the efforts inspired elsewhere have actually created what some people call the transitional justice mafia. They're groups of consultants who go around the world, and like with briefcases, saying, I have a TRC blueprint for you. This makes me reach for my wallet. There's a way in which the idea that you could import from any one country, the way in which that country dealt with its past, so that it's a blueprint for another country, makes me very worried, because one thing we know is that every conflict is different. There's similarities, but every conflict is different. There's a Korean saying that every finger can hurt, and I always want to add, in its own way. But the possibility of something other than criminal trials, something other than war, something other than silence, that's why the TRC, I think, has been such an exemplar to the world. So transitional justice efforts now proceed along varied pathways, sometimes in a confusing way. Take Sierra Leone. When it emerged from its bloody and lengthy civil war, the nation created a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It also, at the very same time, created a tribunal for criminal prosecutions. And the combination apparently confused people. Public opinion polls make that clear about whether to prefer punishment or forgiveness. But the legal institution could steer some public understandings for individuals to forgive those who committed atrocities, while leaving the masterminds to prosecutions. That would be one way to resolve the tension. This tension between criminal prosecution and forgiveness, truth commissions, has now really lit up conversations among international human rights advocates. The Special Court for Sierra Leone did pursue Charles Taylor, who masterminded the violence there. He was the former president of Liberia, and although presidents typically are not ever charged with anything, he did face charges, legal charges of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and he was convicted, sentenced to 50 years in prison. After the conviction, one survivor commented, and I quote him, "One could argue that the conviction of Charles Taylor closes an important chapter in Sierra Leone's history. Some may even call it justice. But court decisions won't rebuild Sierra Leone or other countries where former perpetrators and victims live alongside each other. Rebuilding can only start with purposeful daily decisions to forgive and forge a common future." The person I'm quoting is a man named Samuel Karoma. And he recalled his life as a teacher in Sierra Leone before the Civil War. And he tells about the time he visited a student who had stopped coming to school. Turns out the student had stopped coming to school because he was embarrassed. He had ragged pants, he had bare feet. And Karoma, the teacher, bought the boy, he calls him Vandy, some clothes and shoes, and the boy returned to school. And then the Civil War started. Karoma witnessed the rebels from the Revolutionary United Front burn down his village, murder his sisters, murder his brother-in-law, murder his grandmother. Karoma then was himself captured, and he was told he would now be executed. One of the thousands of child soldiers drawn into the conflict stepped forward and volunteered to serve as the executioner. Karoma recalled, and again I quote him, "The boy led me out of sight of the group to the execution spot under several banana trees. My heart was pounding. My mind was fixed on death. 'Teacher, do you remember me?' the boy asked. 'I will not kill you. You are a good man. Do you remember that you bought me shoes and pants so I could go to school?' I watched in amazement as the young man removed the cover from his head, revealing familiar eyes and a tear-soaked face. Vandy drew a rough map with charcoal to the next village held by peacekeepers, and that's how I crawled to safety and eventually returned to my family." After the war, Karoma found Vandy, and he helped him return to high school and go to university, and they remained friends. And that is the story that Karoma tells in calling for daily forgiveness and rebuilding after violence. And in a similar vein, Jean Siruyambo forgave her neighbor who killed her sons during the Rwandan genocide, even though she didn't forgive right away, and not until the killer had served time in jail after being prosecuted, and not until he had asked her repeatedly for forgiveness, and not until he underwent his own religious conversion. As these stories suggest, people may grant forgiveness, especially when they have a prior relationship. But strikingly, strangers too grant forgiveness. Family members of murder victims have organized in the United States against the death penalty. And yes, we still have the death penalty. The mothers of the young men known as the Guguletu Seven also forgave the government informant who tipped off the police. Sometimes people forgive simply to be free of hatred. Some forgive because they glimpse something in the wrongdoer, something maybe that could change. Sometimes they forgive in order to somehow prolong the connection with the loved one that they lost. Some people forgive while blaming the culprit, but blaming larger forces or other people even more. And forgiveness, I suggest to you, is rather like kindness. It's a resource, and it doesn't have a limit. It's not scarce like water or money. It's within our reach, and it should be one of the many tools we use to get from the past to the future. But if it's forced, it's not forgiveness. If it's forced, it's not a deliberate decision by one who's been harmed to let go of resentment. Law can promote or deter forgiveness, whether by individuals or groups, even as large as a nation. And I cannot help, though, even in this endorsement of forgiveness, raise three more questions before we turn to conversation together. First, does law promote forgiveness? If it does so, does that put too much pressure on private emotions? Second, does the analogy between interpersonal forgiveness and societal or collective forgiveness work? Or does it obscure how societies are really different from individuals? And finally, does forgiveness amount, frankly, to a second-best solution that we turn to only when we can't get real justice? First, is there too much public pressure on private emotion if law or collective action tries to encourage forgiveness? I think there's a risk here. Using the law to push for forgiveness by individuals can be very burdensome. And law, I think, if it is putting too much pressure, but the question is too much, has crossed a line that's unacceptable. Even if someone else can say, you'll feel so much better when you forgive. It's oppressive to be told you have to forgive. And it's oppressive to be told when you're not ready. It's even counterproductive. Only the individual who suffered the harm has the authority to forgive. Nobody else does. And even to expect forgiveness by one who has been harmed is to impose a new burden on the one who was already a victim. Now, in one study, 30% of the participants in your TRC reported that they felt pressure to forgive. I'm not sure that's a good thing. How much pressure is good, how much is bad? Individual human beings are entitled to their own responses to injury and to harm. And any process that makes an individual doubt or feel ashamed of his or her personal response to a violation of the person is another violation of the person. One who's acting in the name of victims can pursue an alternative to court action, but the victim's own choice to forgive or not to forgive has to be recognized. Steered by the high moral ambition of reconciliation, compassion, and peace, law itself is likely to fall short of those high goals and also fail to do what it's good at doing if it substitutes for the forgiveness that's really owned by individuals. On the other hand, and yes, I know, you've heard the joke about the person who said, show me a one-armed lawyer. Why? Because lawyers always say, on the one hand, and on the other hand. On the other hand, it's only honest to acknowledge that legal institutions inevitably affect human emotions and relationships. Participating in a lawsuit affects the people who are involved. It's emotionally draining. It pushes parties even further apart. It magnifies negative emotions that exist because of the underlying conflict. Sometimes the lawyers are even more unforgiving than the parties. Litigation can enlarge the distance between disputing parties. And for this very reason, commercial actors, large corporations, what do when they have long-term business relationships of mutual benefit? They forego litigation. Some even bypass the formalities of a contract, saying we don't want to get near the law. We want to build a trusting relationship. Lawyers only mess things up. If the legal framework inevitably affects emotions, pushing people one way or the other, forgiveness may be no worse than pushing people towards revenge or adversariness or bitterness. It's good to be cautious about the use of law to deliberately shape or manipulate the feelings of any individual, but it is no less important to admit that law does affect human beings, not just in its results, but in its process, and then to take responsibility for how we use the law to do so. Second question, is interpersonal forgiveness the same as societal forgiveness? And the short answer is no. It's really different. And yet I, like others, jump very quickly from talking about two people engaged in apology or forgiveness to talk about political and social issues. And we know that groups and nations are very different than individuals. Crowds behave differently than individuals. A nation may have a head, but it doesn't have legs. It's not a human being. How can a leader then help individuals release their resentments? Does a leader's statements and actions encouraging forgiveness help or create new resentments? These are genuine empirical questions. That's why it's important to have academic study. That's why the studies of the TRC here and of the public opinion towards impunity in Argentina after the fall of the military junta and the restoration of democracy in 1983, and empirical studies of the revival of criminal trials after the ouster of Pinochet in Chile, these are important studies about what affects human beings. What affects our attitudes? What affects our sense about the future? I think that those studies should attend to very particular risks. There are risks for those of us who care about justice that should be examined. For example, if law actually is related to forgiveness, there's a risk that the lawyers and the judges may be tempted to push for it even when it's not warranted. Why? Because it'll reduce the number of complaints, reduce the number of lawsuits, push people out of their chance for a hearing. Using law to prompt forgiveness by individuals in the view of some takes away the very quality that makes forgiveness distinctive. It's exceptional quality. It's non-routine quality. It's separation from formal rules and institutional practice. So that's another thing that people should study. What happens when formal institutions claim to be promoting forgiveness to forgiveness itself? And I think the studies should also very much attend to whether or not individuals who don't want to forgive are given the space to refuse. One woman said about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission here, she said, "A commission or a government cannot forgive. Perhaps only I could do it, but I am not ready to forgive. A government can judge, but only people can forgive. And when a government steps in the direction of forgiveness, it should be careful, because it's trying to change the primary relationships, the relationships between the individuals most directly involved, but it can only do so through secondary relationships, relationships between groups and entities that stand in for those most directly involved. When an official stands in for victims by offering a pardon, for example, the act does not itself directly repair a relationship between a victim and a wrongdoer. It can't. Forgiveness on behalf of a nation is not forgiveness on behalf of the individuals in the nation. And although a pardon may seem to take away authority from victims or their families, it can also be helpful, enable constructive steps towards rebuilding a future. And officials can offer reparations, but when they do so, they're not standing in for the victims. They're substituting for the offenders by seeking restitution or the symbolic acknowledgement of wrong. And official compensation itself can be valuable, but it's not forgiveness either. It simply is a way to try, without any pretense of substituting material benefit for moral judgment or exoneration, to try to make the life better for those who were most injured. After World War II, Germany offered to give reparations to Israel following the Holocaust. And many Jewish people said, "This is blood money, we reject it," until the German government agreed to do two things: to give a public apology and to change their curriculum about how they teach about the Holocaust. One of the difficulties here is that if you're dealing with reparations, who can accept them? Government may be the only entity with standing to accept reparations, or even in some cases to consider forgiving any kind of crime against humanity where all the victims are gone. A government, of course, can itself pardon or exercise its own power to punish with leniency. And a huge question remaining for future study is, when should that power be used? When is mercy appropriate? When is leniency or amnesty appropriate? I can tell you that sometimes it's appropriate simply because it produces a good result. So my local library has a forgiveness program. And if your books have been out way past their due date, they have a forgiveness program, no questions asked, and boy, the books come pouring in. It's great. I don't think anyone's really forgiven. It's true they're not punished, but boy, the library gets their books back. That's really good. But I hope some of you will help to answer these big questions about what really is like and unlike individuals and societies, what really helps societies and individuals after mass violence, and based on evidence. Which takes me to my third question: does forgiveness amount to a second best when justice isn't possible? We may think about substituting forms of forgiveness because of the difficulty in doing anything else. Surviving victims may not know whom to forgive. Legal action is often very difficult. Evidence is inadequate. Events happened long ago. Evidence was destroyed. Wrongdoers hid their actions. The political circumstances can press against legal action. There are dangers of reprisal. There are elections. There are peace negotiations that may be predicated on amnesty or avoiding prosecutions. Or, to put it bluntly, the wrongdoers may still be very powerful. In societies undergoing transitions, often the wrongdoers are still the leaders, they still hold the power. They may even create a Truth and Reconciliation Commission and manipulate it to extend their repression. It has happened. And after mass murders, some societies have a judiciary and groups of prosecutors who are the very same ones who were there before. A new regime may, in contrast, be relatively powerless, or it may have made a deal to dispense with prosecutions in order to gain power. These challenges must be assessed, though, in the context of what are the real alternatives and what are the real goals. Look, the goals after terrible, terrible things that people do to one another are many and multiple and often conflicting. They include helping individuals recover from suffering and helping individuals develop capacities to build their own futures. They include enabling peace and a stable political transition, which aren't always the same thing. They include reducing risks of new violence. They include building a new narrative that accounts for violations and acknowledges the past while offering hope for the future. They include holding wrongdoers accountable for their violations, and they include deterring future instances of mass violence. They may also include trying to make it likely or possible that wrongdoers will experience contrition or be rehabilitated, and self-forgiveness may be a crucial step for that. I hope that paying attention to forgiveness opens rather than closes discussions about these and other varied goals and permits richer and better considerations about what law and justice could mean after oppression, after mass violence. One still new and intriguing legal response to mass atrocity and human rights violations is the Permanent International Criminal Court, founded in 2002, charged with prosecuting those in violation of the most serious human rights violations. Yes, the United States is not a party, unlike 202 other countries. But there are lots of live questions there right now. One real question there is what should be the status of a domestic Truth and Reconciliation Commission? You see, this court, this first permanent international criminal court in the world, loses its power. It has no jurisdiction if the country where the violations occurred takes responsibility and pursues action itself. But it's just not clear whether that action, if it's a truth commission, has that effect. I scoured the debates among those who set up the Truth Commission, and they set up the International Criminal Court, and guess what? They knew the question. They debated it for days, and they decided they couldn't decide. And so it's an open question. I've just edited a book with some colleagues on the work of the court's first prosecutor, and the struggle over the title gives a clue to its contents. I thought it could be called Small Successes, Many Failures, or The Power of the Weak, but the editor said, no, we're going to call it the first global prosecutor. And I can assure you that the book raises more questions than it answers. As I close, I want to invite you to consider questions, to consider the gap between what works between individuals and what works for groups, to consider the contrast between what is right and what is easing difficulties, whether those difficulties are political or psychological or financial or practical. And in this spirit, I say, let us guard against turning to forgiveness solely when no robust justice is available. Let us guard against, at the same time, turning to forgiveness solely when other kinds of justice is available. Let us guard against using official power to distort private emotions. Let us guard against pretending that individuals and groups are the same. But let's also consider how and when we can use our own collective power, sometimes called law, to make space for forgiveness. Because even when law adjudicates the past, we still hope that it will make a better future. And in that spirit, law should explore forgiveness and help us explore forgiveness. Because when you forgive, you cannot change the past, but you can do something about the future. So the future is what it's about. Oscar Wilde, the great humorist, said the only difference between the saint and the sinner is that every saint has a past and every sinner has a future. That's pretty good. Nelson Mandela said, our human compassion binds us to one another, not in pity or patronizingly, but as human beings who have learned how to turn our common suffering into hope for the future. Yogi Berra, who was a ball player, said, the future ain't what it used to be. Abraham Lincoln said, the best thing about the future is it comes one day at a time. And Bill Keane, who's a cartoonist, and with this I closed, said, yesterday is the past. Tomorrow is the future. Today is a gift. That's why it's called the present. Thank you.